My name is Michael Ports. I am a sole proprietor of a small engineering firm, Ports Engineering in Jacksonville, Florida. We practice water resources, navigation, and environmental engineering. I hope that at least some of you had the opportunity to look at this handout material online before you came. If not, it's no big deal. Basically, what we want to do is point out to you what we have here, and then we're going to talk about some of it. You will see the ASCE Code of Ethics, which everybody is a member of ASCE. Yes? Anyone not? Raise your hand. Okay. Oh, you're not. You pointed. Oh, non-member. Okay. Well, for everyone except our one friend is bound to this Code of Ethics. ASCE's Code of Ethics is very similar to the code or the established by each state licensing board. My first question to you is, can anyone name the learned professions? Come on, Walt, you've been in here before. Can you remember? Can you name any of them?
I'm an old guy.
Right.
What can I say?
Yeah, can you name any of them? What are the learned professions?
Medicine.
Yes, doctors, medicine,
Attorneys.
one. Lawyers. Anybody else?
Accountants.
Accountants. There are two more. There are 5 learned professions, right?
Architecture and engineering.
Engineering, not just architectural engineering, but all engineers.
Architecture and engineering.
Architects, I'm sorry, there's one more. Pharmacists, okay? All have professional education requirements and some form of licensure and some form of code of ethics. All of the codes of ethics are more or less similar. I mean, they all have differences, but they're all, the meat, the guts of them are all more or less similar, except there is something different about engineers than all of the other learned professions. Do you know? What is different about engineering as a profession than all of the other professions?
Code of ethics.
No, well, they all have codes of ethics. Everybody has a code of ethics. All right. I think you all know this, maybe you don't think of it as being unique. Engineers owe their responsibility to the safety, health, and welfare of the public. That's your first responsibility. All other professions owe their responsibility to their client. Your pharmacist that gives you a prescription owes his duty to you, not the general public. The doctor who treats you is responsible to you, not the general public. But you, when you design that pier or that wharf facility, your responsibility is not to your client, but to the general public for their safety, health, and welfare. Very different. And as a result of that, we have different ethical dilemmas. We have different ethical questions, and we have to think about the ethical things being ethical in a different way than a lawyer or a doctor or an accountant, even an architect, okay? Does that all make sense? What we're going to do is talk about as many of these 13 over the next 2 hours, these 13 examples, as we can get to, and we're not necessarily going to do them in order. We'll skip around just to drive you nuts. Each one is almost a complete download of the ethical article in Civil Engineering Magazine that comes out every month. I have picked out, actually Bud and I have picked out 13 that we thought are of interest generally. At the top of each one is the date of the article, so you can find it. You could download every month's article since the beginning of the series is downloadable from ASCE's website, okay? Then the title, and generally, they all follow the same format. They give you a problem, a statement of the problem, they call it the situation. They'll ask a question, what are the ethical questions involved? What was some kind of a decision if a decision was made? Sometimes they talk about actual ethical proceedings that are taken before our Committee on Professional Conduct, sometimes before a proceeding in front of a state licensure board. We'll talk about a foreign one later today. And then, you know, kind of what happens at the end. We're going to talk about these and I'm going to ask that you read the first part of it, and then we'll have a discussion and we'll talk about it, and I'll try to answer questions or pose some. And I'm hopeful that our conversation you will find useful. If you go to the very first one from November 2007 on page 9 of 34, asks a very simple question. This was raised in an ethics webinar. It says last month, so it was the month before November of 2007. It's been a few years ago. Someone asked the question, is it ethical to not put the state in which you're licensed on your business card? What is it? Do you have your business card?
Sure, I don't have it on there.
Your address, your PE.
What state are you licensed in, and where do you reside?
I reside in Connecticut, and I'm licensed in 12 states.
Okay. One of them Washington?
No.
Okay. So if you hand your business card to someone while you're here at this conference, are you implying that you're licensed here? If you don't say one way or the other, and you're offering to do engineering services in Washington?
I read this, and I agree with you. It should be on there, yeah.
I'm not so sure I agree with that. First off, when you just hand your business card, it shows a Connecticut address, I assume.
Correct.
And you say you're a licensed PE on your card. Isn't the fair assumption that he's licensed in Connecticut? Maybe some other places, but maybe, suppose you were traveling internationally and you met somebody in the airline lounge in Hong Kong. Would you, by exchanging business cards and talking about what you did for a living to someone who might be a potential client, are you somehow implying that you are licensed to do work in Hong Kong? I think that's maybe carrying it a bit too far, but lots of people do. Many companies, how many show their state of licensing on their, John, you do, good.
Because I'm not licensed in Virginia.
And your address is in Virginia.
Right. And let me tell you, I had that on my business cards for a number of years, and recently I had them reprinted for our new branding. And they left it off, the part about being licensed in Virginia. And I went to the general counsel, and he said, got to reprint them.
Yeah. Most of the larger engineering firms are requiring that you actually put which states on it. And I see it more and more and more and more. More and more.
I would think that at the time when you submit a proposal is the critical time to say whether or not you're licensed in the state.
What about that?
I would agree.
So you have to already have been licensed before you can submit the proposal. You can't wait until you get shortlisted or win to actually apply for reciprocity?
I have done work in other states where I'm not licensed. I've said I'm not licensed, and then I've also said if it's necessary, I will attempt to become licensed in that state. But on my resume, not my business card, it says I'm licensed in California,
Right.
and I practice at times not offering a license practitioner in that state.
Right.
Because of certain disciplines that I provide.
Just interesting. I don't think there's a real hard right answer or wrong answer on this one. I know I have a civil engineering friend who I've known for many years, and I won't mention his name. About this, I disagree with him. He claims, and he was very active in the licensure, he sat on his state licensing board. He was very active in licensing issues at the national level with ASCE for a good while. And he maintained that if you came to the state of Washington and gave a professional paper, you needed to be licensed because that's the practicing of engineering, your hour lecture or whatever it was. And he said if you came to his state and he knew about it, and you gave a lecture at the graduate school, some professional technical lecture, that you were practicing engineering without a license in his state, and he'd report you to the board.
But most professors are not licensed.
That can be another issue.
That's another discussion.
Yeah. I think that's an extreme position. But there are people who think that way. Look at the very next case on page 11. This is from June of 2011. Read down the introduction part, everybody, and then we'll have our discussion. I'll give you a few minutes. What is our responsibility? Just to meet the minimum?
Does ASME standards say in the best public interest, or does it say their obligations to protect their clients?
I don't know the answer to that. Do you know, John?
What's that?
Do you know?
What was the
About-
I'm still reading.
The Mechanical Engineers Code of Ethics state that their obligations to the general public or to their client.
No, to all engineers, it's the general public.
Right.
Attorneys are different.
Doctors are different.
Doctors.
Pharmacists are different. But all engineers are the same.
Okay. In that case, he was taking care of his client, which is using his professional knowledge in the best manner that he could to state what he believed the facts to be, including the safety of this valve.
I know that as a result of this decision, there were changes at ASCE in their standards promulgation process, and I don't know exactly what all that were. Do you remember?
Yeah, my understanding of this case is that the reason ASME was held liable was because of the responsibility of the staff person to assure that the ethics were done right, if you will. And as a result of that, there are procedures when you're creating standards that need to be followed, that need to be, in our case, we're accredited by ANSI, and we have to follow their guidelines and all. So that was the problem. It wasn't so much the individuals on the committee who were advocating their particular positions, but it was somewhat corrupt, and then the staff person allowed it to happen, which is why the corporation became liable.
Then how do you deal with two expert witnesses, both professionals, licensed, with different opinions about the physical facts of the case?
About the physical facts?
Of the case. Who's to predict whether or not a sine bar will form at the entrance to a channel perfectly all the time? No one. Everybody has their opinion about how sediments and currents will behave under different conditions, including storm events.
Okay, but that's, I'm going to split hairs with you. From what I heard about you saying that this expert witness and this expert witness have different opinions about the facts of the case. Well, the facts is not, do not include, is your professional opinion that a bar should have occurred or would have occurred, or it is, what's the bathymetry of the situation, what are the currents, what are the, the grain size distributions, those are the physical facts. And if there are differences about that, that's demonstrable. You know, I can show you that, no, you made the assumption that that the material being moved in that harbor was a silty clay, and I can show you through the tests that were done that no, it's a sandy silt, okay? That's about facts. In virtually every case in which there are opposing views by expert witnesses, that's the conclusions and opinions based on those facts that in which there is a difference of opinion. And that's the case not just with engineers, but with doctors, with everybody, all, you know, all the expert witnesses. And
Well, that's professional judgment, which is drawn upon experience and, quote unquote, the facts.
correct. But generally speaking, the facts are agreed upon, and if they're not, someone's embarrassed when the other side points out that you based your opinions on something that wasn't true. Okay? I mean, that does occasionally happen, and as someone, a substantial amount of my practice is in expert witness work, and when I can find that to be true, it's a surefire winner. You know, that wins the jury for you every time if you can show that the other side has relied on inadequate or wrong information. Doesn't matter what their opinion is about it, or how good your opinion is about the facts that are. Once you show that they've used bad data, they're toast. Has everybody signed? Anybody who has not signed, raise your hand. If you're pre-registered and you're already there, just initial so we know you showed up.
I need it all.
Okay. Just pass it over that way. I told you we weren't going to go in order, but we'll do the third one right there on page 13. Then we'll start skipping around. Read the first two paragraphs and then we'll start. Because all but one of us are a member of ASCE, we all know the code of ethics that we are. So I will just be able to ask you the question, did that engineer's action in inflating the amounts reported on his timesheet violate ASCE's code of ethics? Okay, I think I get a consensus that it did. What is permissible on your timesheet? Okay. I'm going to pose some situations to you and see what you think. You're a sole practitioner, so it's just you. You don't have any employees. You got a client you've agreed to do a task for 10 hours at so much an hour for X dollars, okay? It took you 11 hours to do the work. Do you bill them for 11 hours? So your invoice lies when you said you spent 10 hours instead of 11.
My timesheet would show 11, my invoice would show 10.
Well, as a sole practitioner, do you even keep a timesheet?
Should.
Do you, or do you just write in the number of hours you worked for which client on your calendar that day?
This is a good timesheet.
Right?
Not a good one, but.
Right. Let's say you agree to do that task for 10 hours and it only took you 8, but they agreed to pay you for 10 hours. Do you charge them for 8 or charge them for 10?
On your contract, if it's a lump sum contract, lump sum fee, then the fee's the fee. Now, if it's time materials, then you'd have to charge for the 8 hours.
Now, You're working for somebody else, and you're a relatively junior engineer. Let you remember back that far, see if you can, okay? See if you remember. You're a relatively junior engineer, and your project manager or task guy, maybe you're not even working right for the project manager, asks you to do this particular task. And you say, yes, sir, and you go back to your cubicle and you start going away. And he had told you that this task ought to take, he's got a budget for 10 hours. And about 7 or 8 hours into that task, you're not feeling real comfortable with it, and you go over to him and you ask him about what you're doing. He says, no, you've done this all wrong. This is, you used the wrong assumptions, and you got to start all over again, essentially. And it ends up you actually spent 17 hours doing that task because you screwed up. Okay? How many hours you put on your timesheet?
Depends if you're exempt or not, right?
A junior engineer, you're a professional, you're exempt from overtime. How many hours you put on your timesheet?
Salary or hourly?
Exempt.
You're an exempt employee.
So,
How many?
You put 17 hours in your time sheet.
Okay, now, if you go to Sears Roebuck tomorrow and buy a washing machine, okay, and it doesn't work, you expect to pay for it?
Nope.
Why should you, if you're his employer, why should you pay for work that was wrong?
No, it was exempt. And
No, but his work was wrong. I made it clear, he screwed up. He didn't do what he was supposed to do correctly.
but I think
So the
board's
employer
telling
and
you
the
what-
client ought to pay for him screwing up?
But as the employer, you still have the ultimate responsibility of what he's done. It could be argued that you did not do a very good job of conveying
It'll
direction.
still
Yeah,
get
yeah,
done
yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah.
It'll still get done right. It'll still be right before the dust settles.
Well, who are you asking the responsible? If they're not putting the time on the sheet, you did it wrong for 17 hours or whatever.
It took you 17 hours to do something that should have taken you 10.
You put on your time sheet, it took me 17 hours. Now what the client and the owner of the company you work for decide to do about that's a different question.
No, of course, and depending on what your state you live in, or there are different ramifications. In some states, if you are an exempt employee, in some states you're not necessarily bound to be paid for all those hours, but in some states you are. Now, my response to him when I was a young one, a bunch of those 17 hours were done after 5 o'clock, and I never put them on my timesheet because I screwed up. Said I stayed late and did it on my own time because I corrected my own screw up. That was what I used to do. Okay? Now, as a sole practitioner, I only put down what you let me bill, Doesn't matter how many hours I spend. But they're different. And everybody's got to understand it's different. I tried to pose it differently than I gave you, and here we'll change the scenario a little bit. I gave you a task to do, and I'm only giving you a budget of 10 hours, but I know that it ought to take you 20.
That never happens.
And the reason it's done because I had to underbid our competition, or we would never have gotten the work. So now you're stuck with it, Things change. I just came back last week from a couple of months working in People's Republic of China for a municipal organization, the city of Shenzhen, and it absolutely astounded me. They everybody on their staff that I was working with, all the engineers, they are salaried, okay? They get paid once a month. But when they're given, and the office hours are from 9 to 6, okay? From 9 in the morning till 6, but they get a 2-hour lunch break, okay? So it's a reasonable day. But when each supervisor gives one of their engineers an assignment, it doesn't matter what time it is. They are to work on it until it's done. That means if it worked till 3 o'clock the next morning, doesn't matter. They are to work on it until it gets done. And literally, virtually the entire staff, I watched them because I was there in their office with them and I watched them. They worked virtually every Saturday, all day, and virtually every Sunday, at least a half a day, usually 3/4 to a full day. Week after week after week after week. When they're given an assignment, they just keep, their supervisor gives them an assignment, they just keep working until it's done. It's a very different ethical, and they think of it as an ethical issue. When you give me something to do, I'm going to do it until it's done. It's a very different climate. Very, very, very different climate. Sure.
3 in the morning?
No. No, because they're paying me by the hour.
Let me ask you a question on that. They say it's an ethical issue that you have to finish it.
Right.
I give you a 20-hour task to do. You have to finish it before you go home. Do I, as a supervisor, have an ethical duty to not give you a 20-hour task that you have to finish before you go home? That, you know, that.
I asked
the
about
supervisor
that.
has some responsibility.
Sure they do, but they're not doing that arbitrarily. They're doing it because of the pressure that's coming from the politicians saying this project must be designed because we are going to start construction on this day. And when they have obviously a very different system. Here, we let the process play its course and then construction follows, okay? There, when they say they're going to start construction on the 1st of October, construction starts on the 1st of October, and it doesn't matter what you raise or how you will, the plans will be ready. You know, no matter you say no, we're going to start, when they say construction will begin on a day, it begins on that day.
The building falls down and goes to jail.
The politicians, the heads of those agencies, and they're putting them in jail. It's not that, it's that they forego, they don't have all the other stakeholders that have any stake. I mean, they may have a stake, but they have no stick, you know. They issue them each, everything's owned by the government, you know, or one form of government or the other, and the federal government owns the provincial governments and they own the municipal governments, right? So it's all, whatever Beijing says, that's what happens.
We're talking about another country, not the United States.
Yeah, but it's interesting to compare their,
When something is involved, someone's liable.
right,
It's settled, if it goes to court, it's settled in court. Whether the engineer has all, the expert has all the information.
Right.
The purpose of the court is to determine it.
that's correct.
based
You're
on
absolutely
that
correct.
Engineer's qualifications and education
That's correct.
and engineering judgment.
That's correct. You're correct in that regard. All right, let's switch to the,
Just real quick,
Yeah.
touching the previous topic again,
Yeah, yeah.
as far as training, I think it's a good topic, and then was there so it's really comes down to sort of an ethical dilemma within the employer, right? As far as what portion of it will the employer take responsibility and pay for as training, and then where's that balance? You know, some of it benefits the employee, you know.
Oh,
goes through the
absolutely.
learning curves, and
Absolutely.
How do you deal with that balance? I think that's really the question.
yes,
In the federal government and state government, you expect to do employee development. That is part of what you allocate time to. In cost-shared projects, you have a estimated cost and time frame that the project manager has an obligation to the client to ensure that that's met, because cost overruns are not acceptable to municipalities who don't have extra money. So the project manager as well as the supervisor have to look at who's going to be assigned the job, what is their experience, and how much will we allocate to development so that we can have that person ready for the next job.
Mm-hmm.
When they get sloppy, however, and do a huge cost overrun, as a project manager, your obligation is to fire them, which means you're not going to provide a cost code any longer. It's not that the employee doesn't get paid. They do, because it's a fixed salary per month. But that particular branch chief starts running into trouble. And that's the way it works now. It wasn't that way before. It used to be, spend it as long as you got it. In fact, in September, spend everything else that's on the table. So times have changed, and a part of what a government supervisor has to consider is that there's no middle management in the government right now, because there was a 20-year hiring freeze and nobody filled the middle. All the old guys retiring and all the young people coming in don't have experience. So you have to allow for on-the-job training.
I think that's true. What's your experience?
This problem, I guess I see it as the only ethical problem to the client would be if you are charging for those extra hours, when that's really not their fault or their problem. And then the employee, they have an ethical dilemma, like did they follow what their supervisor said, or did they go off on their own and not listen, or, you know, and that's where he needs to decide ethically what should he charge for and what not. And then it ultimately becomes what the employer's agreement is with the employees. Do they charge over 40 hours a week, or do they just, you know, keep to 40 no matter how many hours they go?
Right, there's a lot of training implies there's a, or at least the way you did it to me implies, the way you said it, the young engineer, if the young engineer was not sure about how to proceed, maybe it was the first time they'd ever done that particular analysis, and they weren't sure, they should have spoken up. They had some ethical responsibility to say, I don't know what I'm doing. Hey, Sam, can you help me? You know, can you show me, point me in the right direction? Or if they say no, they thought they knew what they were doing and simply made a mistake. You know, we're all human. We do make errors. That's why we have quality assurance, quality control programs, right? But there's some responsibility that each of us have to know, am I confident that I can do this task before I do it? Do I know, am I competent? Do I know how to do that? Okay? And if not, how do you get competent to do it? Is it simply a matter of asking a question? Do I need to go read a book? Do I need to go take a class? Do I need to, depending on what the situation is. There's some ethical responsibility on that supervisor's part. Do you know the folks that you're assigning tasks to? Do you know whether they've ever done it before? Do you know, should you say, I'd like you to do this analysis. And by the way, go ask John or Sally, because they've done 3 of them in the last couple of months, to make sure that you're headed off in the, you know, isn't there some responsibility there as well? So again, as we'll go through these various discussions, you'll see I never give you enough information to answer the question. And so much depends, right? But that's called real life, right? And you can have lots of different scenarios, you know. One of those, maybe I just, as your supervisor, I don't like you and I'm looking for an opportunity to can you by the end of the year, and so I'm giving you difficult things to do that you're going to screw up on, you know? You know, I mean, if you've been around long enough, you've seen that happen before in your past.
Michael,
Yeah.
I think this case is talking about when a company, someone underbid the project they didn't, you know, they cut down the billing rate in order to win it, and then the supervisor comes back to the employee to say, I'm not getting enough per hour for you, I need you to put in more hours so I can bill more even though you're on salary. So I think that's.
Oh, yeah,
the
yeah.
deal.
In this particular case.
That's the ethical question here.
In that particular case, the one that we started the conversation with, you were absolutely correct. I just let it go far afield to lots of other examples because while all of us don't have this same example in our experience, we all have similar kinds of timesheet issues and you've come across it at various times in your career. So I, immediately, and that's what I want to do with all of these issues as we go, to open it up to us, not just talk about the specifics of the case. While we just spent some time on employers' responsibilities, turn to page 33. And just recently, this was just in the May 2013 Civil Engineering magazine, and it really caught my eye. Just read the first 3 paragraphs to set the situation up, and then we'll have a discussion. If you've been around any length of time in this business, something like this has happened to you, or you've seen it happen to somebody right next to you. When times get tough things happen.
Sounds like got lawyers involved in this one.
Right. This was on at least one, maybe it says, I've forgotten, of the aggrieved engineers that was let go, actually filed a complaint with ASCE's Committee on Professional Conduct, and without reading ahead, and was the employer at fault with breaking the ethics by having a written policy and not following it?
Employer can change the policy at will.
But is that ethical? Maybe that's legal, but is that ethical?
Not sure. Why not?
Well, the Code of Ethics, Canon 7 states, engineers shall provide opportunities for the professional development of those engineers under their supervision. While most of this canon's guidelines are aspirational, right? Go ahead.
I'd argue that the policies in place at the time of hiring were the circumstances under which the employee accepted the employment offer by the employer for a certain salary. If there was a greater risk involved, such as I can change my mind about anything at any time, then I would expect higher compensation to justify the risk, and could choose to go to another place and seek employment there instead of taking the offer provided by the employee at the owner.
Thoughts?
Almost all employee relationships are employee at will, which means the employer can terminate the employee for any reason, good, bad, or none at all. So in theory, anytime they could terminate you and rehire you with new terms, or just change the terms on their own, at least from a legal standpoint. Ethical is a little different.
Well, is it
There's
ethical?
no fixed, we're going to be here for a year. The vast majority of contracts, maybe some people do get term contracts, but typically you can leave and they can fire you at any time.
Right.
My argument is it's an ethical issue. If this is what I read their policies and I make a decision about the risk of the environment and accept a certain salary based on how I read what were the environmental conditions at the time, then they change their mind. I certainly work for people like that, but not for very long.
This is not really any different than any vacancy where even an agency that has entitlement programs for long-term compensation after the retirement, if the agency is out of money, that's right. they run out of money, they run out of money. I suspect what's not said here is that there is probably discussions about the economic downturn in the company and ways to deal with that. Prior to closing the office, there were many discussions about how to cut costs and keep the office profitable.
Sounds to me like the employer did a pretty good job. He found places for other people. He's trying to make do with the money he doesn't have. And one of the ways was, instead of paying whatever he's gonna pay, he's got a band pool. And so the employee should say, well, yeah, I'll go along with that. I'll do my share. And, you know, going back in history, I can't count the number of times I've moved and relocated and so forth, but it sounds like the employer was really working. You know, he says, well, gee, we can't afford to do such and so, but we can afford a van pool, and you still have a job, and that all sounds pretty good. And it sounds like he was doing it, but that the employees didn't seem to want to bend.
I think that they did seem to try to help the employees find other positions and things, but the biggest ethical problem would probably be when they chose not to take the assignment, and the employer said, well, no, then, you know, you're just quitting. Basically, you're not, you know, eligible for any benefits. They could, you know, ethically, we all understand, you know, money crunches and things like that, but if they had worked with them and tried to do something, and, you know, not just treated it as, you chose not to take this, so therefore you don't get anything. I think that's unethical myself.
The reason, if you read the whole thing, you'll see that the Committee on Professional Conduct voted to take no action. So they did not find that the employer was at fault. To me, and I know Bud Goodwin shares this, the take home from this exercise, this particular example, is that when you take an action as a supervisor or an owner or anyone in authority, whether it be at an agency or a firm, a company of some kind, when you take an action, you have certain legal responsibilities. And you all obviously want to follow those legal responsibilities. And I think you gentleman in the back there was pointing out that from the very beginning, that what was legal. Your code of ethics also has put on you an ethical responsibility, and you need to think about the ethical consequences of whatever you do. Now, I don't think in this case that, as some of us have ventured their opinion, I don't think that this particular employer in this particular case did something that was really egregious, and our society's Committee on Professional Conduct agreed. But whenever you're in a position of authority and you make what you would think is a personnel or administrative or a non-engineering decision that affects your employees, it would be a good idea to stop and think before you leap and do it, about what your ethical responsibilities are.
On that point, you better think before you leap and put something in a manual that you give people to read as a condition of hiring them, because you can lock yourself into stuff, because, as it was pointed out, the employee can expect to get what it says. So you better be pretty careful about what you put in those manuals.
Yes. Right. Right. That's definitely the case. Go back one page, page 31. This is not a real case. My friend of mine, Steve Sterrett from Kansas State, he's on the faculty at Kansas State. He teaches several ethics courses, and he's pretty good at it. Usually, he put together a series of getting students, engineering students, to think about ethics, and one way to try to teach them professional ethics was to have them put on skits or little plays doing this. This article, which appeared in January last year, 2012, in Civil Engineering Magazine, the article is taken, and this example is taken from those student skits at Kansas State, okay? So it's not a real, a real deal. But just read the first few paragraphs on the first page there, and we'll talk about it. How many have done a percolation test? Just a couple. How many are at least familiar with the test in the terms of effort and time it takes to raise your hand? So that's maybe half of us. Though you might not have done one yourself, but are you familiar with what effort and what it would be like? Would somebody, okay, how much time would it take you to do one? You have all the equipment in your office. What would you?
I guess, let's say, it took an hour to get to the site.
Forget travel to and from, just while you're there. How quickly could you run a couple hours? You could run a test. So you could do, if you went out there for a half a day, you could get another couple of tests, maybe 3, depending on when you broke and how long it took you to get there and all that. I just wanted to throw that out. Now, the developers are always saying stuff like that, right? Make it work. I'm not going to give you any more money. Make it work. And I need this to go through on this schedule, right? I mean, they're always doing that. What's the engineer's responsibility? What's the manager's responsibility? Come on, talk about this. What ought to happen?
I think the engineering company should find a new client.
Sometimes that's a real good answer. But I don't have, you work for developers more than I do, right?
I've seen instances where this has happened.
Right.
They cooked the books a little bit, the groundwater rose, the public health department shut down a whole 40, 50 unit residential development. So the engineer would want to be, in an abundance of caution, as conservative as possible, because the downside is pretty shocking. And the health department will red tag an entire subdivision. That's the downside.
Right, and you would assume that every firm who's doing any development work at all in any locale would know that.
Yes.
I mean, that also ought to be a given.
The simple answer here is.
Speak up.
Simple answer is to the developer, well, any engineer is going to come up with the same results we have. You're going to have the same problem. And they say, yeah, well, I'll get an engineer that's going to sign off on it. It's okay. Well, when the environmental firm or the pools sue, we're going to have the data that we have.
Right. Now, to me, there's two areas of ethical tension here. One is between the engineer, employee, and their supervisor, the management of the engineering firm. And the second one is between the engineering firm and the client. And I posit to you that they are different ethical dilemmas. Based on my limited experience and Walt's great experience with developers, that the manager ought to be saying, regardless of whether they're going to pay you to run out there and take a couple more tests, that's another issue. But you're going to go out there and find 2 more or 3 more that work, right? I would, and collect that additional data. I mean, that would That would be my tendency if I were that manager, if at all possible. You're going to go out there and you're going to go take those tests quick. You know, and not argue about it. But is it anybody's experience? Now, and forget about whether it's a percolation test. You can draw parallels with other things like this in your own, where you say, we really have to have this other information. We have conflicting data here. We really need something else. You got to go out and take some more measurements. And the answer is no. What, has that come up?
We've gone
Can
out
you
and done it on our own dime. Just to answer the question, you got A and B, you need to break that tie.
Okay.
Come back out and done some more borings or some more testing.
Right. Now, what has been the result of that?
Sometimes good, sometimes bad.
And when it's bad, talk about it. Tell me more about your example. Come on.
Well, the example would be down in Florida, seasonal high.
I mean, you don't have to name anything, but just.
Water tables are the big issue down where we're from.
Right.
So, that design, that water table can make or break the design, where they've got to raise site grades 3 feet or the same. Fill's not cheap. So a foot or two in the seasonal high water table can make a huge cost implication for the project.
Right.
But, as he was saying, if it's wrong and the first floor of the buildings go underwater, you know, you're gonna be getting a real nasty phone call. down the line.
Is that all you're going to get, is a nasty phone call?
First. And then it progresses. So, you know, our take is always, the data is what the data is. Here's the value. We're not going to make the developer happy. If it's 1 foot, it's 1 foot. I'm sorry, sir, that's the data.
Right. Right. More.
I think this probably has less to do with the fact that we'd like to go out and get more samples as to how we present the data in the end, because what would likely happen is you go out, maybe on your own dime, you do 3 more tests, 2 of them pass, 1 doesn't. So now you've got X number that pass, you still have X number that don't. So it's, how do you present that to?
How do you present it?
You'd say, this is the number of tests that we did, and here are the number that passed, and here are the ones that didn't. Here's the site plan. Maybe there's a trend. Maybe at certain part of the sites in those particular soils, they all passed, and over here they didn't. So look for a solution, but present all of the data that you ended up with, because if it does end up being an issue with contamination of this pond, guaranteed that all of that data will be requested, whether it passed or not.
Right. That's right. More.
It seems to me this particular example is almost black and white. There are many other examples. In this particular example, there's no question. You have to err on the side of conservatism, because a failure, if it's going to occur, will happen soon. There will be litigation. It will adversely affect the firm. It seems it's more important to really have very frank and almost honest discussions with the client, so the client is aware that there are downsides, and that the client would, I've told clients that you will hate the day you started this project because of the problems that will occur. So you're much better off to have some good discussions with the client, and I think if done well, you might actually develop a better relationship with the client. Some clients do not want to spend the money. At the end of the day, you said you're better off to find a new client, because a case like this you will find out if you were a little too liberal, and it will have a very negative effect.
Yeah.
I agree that the way it's spelled out is pretty black and white, there's no question.
Yes, this
I mean,
case is.
But the gentleman at the back pointed out a good thing. This is a time to look for engineering solutions. Either identify areas that are good and bad, or even a whole nother concept and not use leach fields, use, you know, some kind of treatment and.
Package plant.
Yeah, you could do all kinds of things to educate your client, but from an ethical standpoint, it's black and white. Yeah, you got the data's the data.
Right.
And if the client.
Before I call on you, I want to say, throw something in, okay, and then we'll go right to your thought. You have to remember, as I pointed out at the beginning, this is an exercise for student engineers, so it is much more black and white than what we would actually have in real practice. Go.
No, mine was just more of a general comment. I understand it's a fictitious example, but I know in our state where we're at, they wouldn't even try to put an apartment complex on a septic field. So I don't know why he's even trying to do that.
There you go.
Well, it depends on where you are. Depends on yes.
I think a more interesting twist on that was, let's say I get fired, they hire a new engineer, and the new engineer submits. Now what do I do? Because I know better.
What is your responsibility? I know what I think the answer is. I know what I think the answer is. I think I also know what my buddy here next to me, Bud Goodwin, would say as a lawyer. But before I share that with you, I want to hear what you have to say about it. You say it again.
If I was the first engineer and I get fired because I don't.
You refuse, right?
Let's just say I'm just no longer working for this client, and they find a different firm that submits partial data to the agency. What are my obligations?
That's a good question.
It's always interesting how the city council tends to find information in situations like this.
Yes?
Especially if it's an area that they're concerned about protecting.
Right.
I had a question. Is the manager who he reported to, is the manager a professional engineer? And
I don't believe
in my
it's.
case, if they reported up the chain
Right.
to another professional engineer who is above them as a manager, then, I mean, the ethic, because that's kind of my understanding. If you report it up the chain, then the engineer highest up the chain is ultimately responsible.
Right.
So I think that would be, I mean, my question is
Right. Who is in responsible charge in this case? I don't think it's clear in this student example who was in responsible charge. I don't think it's not clear. If it was the engineer, the lowest person on that totem pole, was the one in responsible charge that's going to seal the drawings or the report that goes in. Let's use your example and let's ask the question. They refuse to submit just the positive information and they get fired, or they quit over it, doesn't matter which one. And 6 months later, they see that the application, because it's in the local newspaper, you know, has been submitted, and the planning board's going to issue their, you know, have a hearing and issue their permit next Thursday night, okay, whatever it is. What's the ethical responsibility for that first engineer that had been in responsible charge but was no longer? What is their ethical responsibility?
Testify at the hearing.
Yeah, well,
I've been in that situation before, and what I think it's inappropriate to write I would not write a letter, a formal letter. The likelihood of being sued would be quite high. I have, however, contacted a colleague at a local agency who was responsible for reviewing it, just to give him a heads up, just to let him know that we were involved. We did not think it met the necessary minimum design requirements, and that, as it turns out, the reviewing entity internal to the agency reviewed it, came to the same conclusions.
is that a reasonable?
Pretty consistent with what I meant.
Right.
State practice imposing a duty to engineers who are aware of violations of the code of ethics to report it to the board. I would think many states have that as well. So
Every licensing jurisdiction has that, and we're going to talk about that coming up.
I would think you're under ethical, under the
Well,
law
first off,
obligation, if that is a violation.
well, okay, but first off, I was very careful to listen to exactly the words that you spoke, and he did not say that he knew what data that had been submitted. Okay? He doesn't know that they didn't go out and take 6 more tests and they all passed. And 2 of them were in the vicinity of the ones that had, and they must have been faulty, therefore. You know? And that everything is copacetic. Because you didn't, you know, that You just saw the thing in the newspaper that this application was before the board, and you suspected that there might be some hanky-panky going on. I think Walt's suggestion was very good, which hadn't really, I hadn't thought about going directly to the reviewer. But in most communities, if you're in this business, you will have a professional relationship with all that reviewing staff because so you can go have lunch with Sally or Harvey or whoever it is and talk to them about it in a professional way, and I think that's an excellent deal. But there's the gentleman, and I don't know your name, but you mentioned you have, what about your responsibility? Let's say that the next person that submitted it just submitted the positive information. They didn't take any more data. They ignored the negative stuff. And you talk to your reviewer friend, and they go in, and a month later, the reviewer friend tells you, you were right, Walt. That stuff was bad. That's why we turned it down. We never issued the permit for it. Thanks for letting us know. Now you know that somebody did something unethical. What's your responsibility at that point? John? What is your responsibility at that point? I mean, some of the folks in here I know well and have known for many years, so they're going to get called on.
Wouldn't you report it to the board?
You must. It's not a matter of you have a choice in the matter. If you don't report that and the board somehow learns that you knew and you didn't report it, what can happen to you? You can lose your license. I said, what is the one difference that in the engineer's code of ethics, or in the codes of ethics of all the professions, what's different from engineers and all the others? We talked about that you have your primary obligation is to the public, not to your client. What is the one difference between the licensing requirements of engineers and the licensing requirements of all other professionals, whether it be pharmacists, accountants, doesn't matter, lawyers? What is it?
Public at large.
No. If you are aware of an ethical violation of another licensee, you must report it. And if you don't, and it's found out, you can lose your license. You must rat on your colleagues. All right? Can't remember where we're going to come across it. One of these. All right, let's see if I can find it.
That's why you shouldn't just charge $5 for these tests, because there's a lot of risk involved.
Yeah.
Another.
Please.
It was pointed out, both of you pointed out that before you raise the issue, you have to know what indeed was reported and how it was reported. You have to know, so you have to have access to the report. What if it's a situation where you don't have access to it, and so you have no way of knowing? You suspect, but you don't know.
Well, I think that.
Same question. So.
Yeah, and I think your suggestion applies. You have some reasonable reason, okay, to suspect that there may have been something wrong. You go to that reviewer, whoever is responsible to, that is reviewing that to issue the license or the permit or the approval or whatever it is, and you express your reservations, and you say, look, I don't know what they ultimately submitted, but I know here's what I reviewed when I was working on it. Here's the situation that I saw, and I didn't think that it was a perkable or whatever the deal is, you tell them and say, I just doing this to give you a heads up so when you review it, you can take that into account. Now, it seems to me you've fulfilled your ethical responsibility. You thought there's a possibility that something might be wrong. You let somebody who was in a position to look at it and find out what the facts are. I don't even think you have an obligation at that point to ever go back and find out from them. It's really, you fulfilled your obligation. You don't have to. But like I said, maybe the following month you have lunch with Charlie again, or Suzette, or whoever it was that was the reviewer, and they tell you, oh, thanks for giving us the heads up, but they went out and did a bunch of other tests, and obviously after you left that firm, and everything works, I've reviewed it, everything's cool, and that's fine. Or, no, hey, I'm glad you told us that. What you feared was exactly what they did, and you know, and that's why we told them they had to either go out and get more information, or we're not issuing the permit, or whatever the, you know, I mean, there's a gazillion different scenarios that could possibly be, but you see that's if you're not sure, because always you're never exactly sure, especially if you leave an employer.
But if you're not sure and you raise the issue with somebody, then the scuttlebutt is that you're smearing somebody and you don't know the basis of. I mean, you know, you don't have any backup.
Well, I'd be very careful about what you said. I would be very careful about what I say to a reviewer, and it would have certainly be partly a function of how well I knew them and what kind of a relationship I had with them. But I'd be very careful not to say things like, so-and-so told me to do this. You know, I wouldn't say that. I'd say, man, I was really troubled with that data that we had about percolation. Only half of the tests that we performed perked, and the other half not. Man, they just failed miserably. And the client didn't seem willing to do any more testing, and I was just really uncomfortable with it, and frankly, that was partly why I left the firm. Now, you never said that anybody told you to do anything nefarious. You haven't cast aspersions, you just saying the data that was collected you were very uncomfortable with. You know?
Just to follow up on that, and I appreciate the comments, but the original question that you asked was, do you have a duty to report it to the board?
Yes.
And the issue with reporting it to the board, and I never have, but I have talked to reviewers, and agency city reviewers have reported engineers to the board. But as I understand, you've not done it, you need a lot of specifics to be able to give the board a complete chronology, much more detailed than this example, so that the board can make an informed decision. I would suggest that 99.9% of the time, even someone involved in a project that's essentially been replaced with someone else, you don't have all the facts. It's only the agencies who are reviewing, and if they wish to take it upon themselves, can make additional inquiries. But I can't see where anyone in this room would be afforded the opportunity to actually report something to the board.
Yeah, this is
Because
where
you don't have the information.
this is where I wish that Bud was standing here next to me, because he would address this, and I know he's addressed this in the past, and about specifically when you make a complaint or when complaints are made about you to the board. In either way, he's got a lot of opinions about that, and
There's a very big difference between reporting it to the board and reporting it to a local agency review.
That's correct. You are correct. Yes.
Following up what this gentleman's saying, we haven't taken the perspective of the regulating staff who has to make a recommendation to whoever is going to be signing that permit. They have an obligation to the public as well. And if there is a lawsuit, and what would be sued on is a decision to allow the project to go forward, really creates a real problem for the regulatory agency and for the staff and everybody else who's involved, including the decision maker. So, getting information from other sources is critical to making a good decision because you want a complete file. If there is a potential problem with somebody providing faulty information, having been in the position, that file is passed to the Office of Counsel. The Office of Counsel proceeds and makes their own decisions about how they're going to handle it.
I think in our state, it says if you believe there to be ethical violations, not if you know there are ethical violations. So maybe it comes down to you, what is enough to convince you that you believe there to be. You don't have to provide the entire case right there. You just have to report it if you believe there to be violations.
I do know this, and I'm going to put Bud's hat on. I'll move over here just a little bit. It's not up to you as the licensed professional to be the detective and the prosecuting attorney to build. There's no duty for you to investigate. I do know that in any jurisdiction. You do want to be careful because your complaint is public information. Everybody here, or virtually everybody here, is licensed. How many have had a complaint filed against you at a state board? Anybody? Walter? Come on, I'm going to hold my hand up. Nobody else? Just two of us? Do you want to talk about your complaint?
I had a judgment by the board, but there was no complaint. I missed paying my dues one time.
Oh.
Mine was a very interesting situation. We designed a seawall for someone and got permits. We had a contract with a CM firm, and we literally went way beyond our required scope of work. There were discretionary contracts, discretionary permits required. It was taking much more time. They had a not to exceed fee, and we blew past that fee because of discretionary issues. So it's not a technical issue, it's a contractual issue and a fee issue. We ultimately, and we were asking to get paid for what we were doing. They refused to pay. We ultimately, because we were afraid of the CM firm, we finished the design work. We're never able to, so we at least completed that work, way over budget. And then we stopped work. After we completed all of our work and gave everything to the regulatory agencies, they sued us because we failed to complete our work, and there was some obscure line in the contract, not about indemnity, but about continuing to do work in spite of a dispute, in spite of pay. Then they reported us to the board. Now, ultimately, it took some effort. The board did not find that we were at fault, but this was and I did more research. This person had done this before. And probably one of the most important take-home messages is that in the contract there was some obscure language that said that we would agree to continue to work in spite of any disputes of fees because time was of the essence to get everything completed. But we at least worked to a point where we felt that we would be exonerated, but it was a painful experience, and this guy was just grinding us. He had grinded other people, other consultants.
Comment?
So it's not a technical issue.
Yeah, they usually aren't. Yeah, comment?
Whose contract was it, yours or his?
His contract. A contract that we
I
had.
got some for sale that'll be better for you.
We had spent 6 months debating the contract. Ed had worked that had about $30,000 in fees that they would pay us until we had signed their contract, and we had an attorney looking at it, and it was awful.
I've forgotten now whether it was either in 2000 or 2001. I was hired by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Mississippi Valley Division as an expert witness to help defend them in a suit between a class action suit of all the drainage districts along the Mississippi River from St. Louis to St. Paul, about an illegal taking of, part of it was an illegal taking, and about all on the levees for all the drainage districts along the upper Mississippi River. Such suits, claims against the federal government, are held in the U.S. Court of Claims in the District of Columbia. Now, the U.S. Court of Claims has jurisdiction across all the United States and its territories, and hears claims about takings and other issues, claims against the various parts of the U.S. government. As a courtesy to the plaintiffs, which are, in this case, were the drainage districts, the court will physically sit in some other courtroom. In this particular class action case, one of the districts, which is Henderson Drainage District number 3 in Illinois, was chosen as a test that we would go ahead and do let the suit go through on its merits with the facts with this drainage district, and then based on that results, either decide what to do with all of the drainage districts. As a courtesy to the local plaintiffs, the judge traveled to Henderson County, Illinois, and for 3 weeks we tried the case in the Henderson County Courthouse. That the local county court loaned their courthouse to the U.S. Court of Claims. We, during the proceedings, everybody here ever served as an expert witness? Everybody who has, raise your hand. And just a sizable minority. Well, the first thing that happens is that the side that is paying you puts you up on the witness stand, and they go through a process called voir dire, which is to go over your qualifications, and then the judge makes both sides, you get asked about what your qualifications are, and then the other side gets to cross-examine you about your qualifications, and then the judge determines you are or are not an expert in some particular field. And that's the first thing that happens. And then you go through your testimony, your professional testimony, whatever, as an expert. Only expert witnesses, and this is true in both state and federal courts, only expert witnesses are allowed to give opinions. All other witnesses are fact witnesses and can only testify, yes, I saw Johnny walk into the bank with a gun. You know. No, I think he was going to rob it. They can't say that. Okay? You as an expert witness can offer opinions. That's why they're hiring you. You have an expertise and you can give your opinions. I gave my opinions, explained my analysis, was cross-examined. The case was closed. The judge issued her ruling and cited my testimony in the defense of what the court had done in her reasoning, and dismissed all the counts about the unconstitutional takings and the bad effects that the Corps' design had done on their drainage district. several months later, I don't remember exactly when it was, I got a telephone call from a nice lady, had a nice voice. She said she was so-and-so, I've forgotten her name, from the Illinois State PE Licensing Board. And was I Michael Ports? And I said, yes, I am. She said, were involved in yada, yada, yada? And I said, yes. And I asked her, I said, why are you asking me these questions? And she says, because there's been a complaint filed against you with the board. And I said, well, what is it? You know, what's the complaint? And, well, I'm not going to tell you. And I said, well, I'm not going to answer any questions. And how the hell can you ask, you know, pick up the phone, not ever notify me that there's been a complaint filed about me in Illinois? And how do you have jurisdiction in what happened in a federal court? You know? And she said, eventually, she was just a clerk, right? Not a lawyer. She was just a clerk doing what she was told. Conversation ended. I immediately picked up the phone and called the folks at the Corps, told them what was happening, and the Justice Department lawyers, who then immediately issued some subpoenas on the Illinois board to get some information. And the judge of the federal court says, you will hereby leave Mr. Ports alone. What he does in federal court is my business, not yours, and you have no jurisdiction. And he did not need to have a license in Illinois to work in the federal court, to do the analysis in federal court. So that was all dismissed, but you can have claims filed against you for all kinds of reasons. That was the same individual. It was the head shaker from the Drainage District number 3 that had just gotten thrown out. He also filed a complaint with every other state board in which I was licensed, and they all of them said, well, hey, he didn't do anything in my state, you know, and ignored him. But so everywhere I'm licensed, I've got a complaint from that guy. And if you do expert witness long enough, Bud tells me that you will have complaints filed against you. Let's turn.
On that,
Yeah.
Is the providing of expert opinion, is that the practice of engineering?
Absolutely.
So all experts should be licensed?
In the proper jurisdiction.
Okay, what if there's a, I'm just throwing states out there, what if there's a dispute over something that was engineered and happened in California, but for legal reasons, the case is taking place in Texas?
How would that be?
Maybe it's a large suit with corporations and they agreed to venue in Texas.
Well, then it's not in a California court, it's in a federal court? It's got to be.
It could be state court.
Well, Texas isn't going to try something in California, not in one of their state courts.
It could be an issue pertaining to California.
But,
It could happen.
not exactly the way you presented it can't. It would have to be in federal court, in a federal court. In a federal court, just like the most federal agencies with their engineering designs, they want a licensed practitioner, but you don't necessarily have to be licensed in the state where that project is. As long as you're licensed somewhere, they're happy. Okay, that's generally the case.
You could have a contractual situation where it says in the contract that this is under the laws of a certain state and not.
Or you could stipulate the venue and laws.
And not in the state.
Yeah,
where the work is.
but if everybody's in California, and they're not going to pick Texas for their venue, but that, regardless.
I have an interesting case that involves the Corps of Engineers and states and all opinions.
Yeah.
When we were doing the investigation in Katrina in Louisiana,
we had sent down a team of folks from ASCE, only one of whom was registered in the state of Louisiana. So they were doing their investigation, et cetera. During the course of that investigation, it was discovered that there was some concern about some imminent failures that may occur that could be catastrophic. And so at the time, we said, well, we'll write a letter to the Chief of the Corps of Engineers. And then I thought, we don't have any standing to write a letter to the Chief of the Corps of Engineers about something in Louisiana. We're investigating to learn things. We're not practicing engineering. We're going to write that letter, which we do have the obligation now of the health, safety, welfare. We need to make sure that letter is written by a registered engineer in Louisiana. Fortunately, we had one. It could have been that we had none.
Right. You have to be very careful about jurisdictions. You do. Let's turn, we've been talking a lot about this, to page 23. Canon 1 tells us, first off, that's where our responsibility to the public to safeguard the health, safety, and welfare of the public is. It's in canon number 1. Right? And under that, it requires, in the guidelines to practice, requires engineers with, quote, knowledge or reason to believe that another person or firm may be in violation of any of the provisions of Canon 1 to present such information to the proper authority in writing and cooperate with the proper authority in furnishing such further information or assistance as may be required. So there's no obligation that we have to be the investigator or the prosecuting attorney, but we do have to report. It's all based on our first code of ethics from 1914, in which we said in our code of ethics that we would police ourselves as a profession. That's where it stems, that we would do it ourselves. We don't have the time. We're going to talk about a few more other issues to sit and read about this, but I would take more comments about our obligation to rat on our fellow engineers. Is anyone aware of anybody ratting anybody else out in your own career? Yes?
I designed a ship dock for Port of South Louisiana. And at that time, of course, we had our famous governor, Governor Edwards, but his take on it, I won't talk about it. But they had a port commission. And this engineering firm hired me as a consultant to design the dock. And it was for Panamax size ships, big dock, no way big. And there was another engineering firm in New Orleans that had wanted to do that work, and they didn't get the work. I didn't even know they were going to be involved. And they did their political games with the Port of South Louisiana. And when it was all finished, completed, the contract was completed, they had the port called for like an inspection walk, you know. And didn't call me, didn't let me know. But this engineer from New Orleans, he was there. So he thought it would look good for him to do his comments here and there. And in the port, at the Port Commission, I went to the next meeting when I heard about it. And he wouldn't bring it up in that meeting because he knew it was there. But all his points, if he had checklist, were not valid. He was not competent as a dock designer. And the thing that irritated me that they called him in and he was playing politics to get it. So I made a complete report and took it to the PE board, state PE board, and they called him on the carpet. They didn't take his license, but they called him in.
You fine him?
I don't remember if they found him.
Most disciplinary actions are either fines. I won't say that. Bud would flog me for it. I notice when the Florida PE, I'm licensed, one of the states I'm licensed in is in Florida, and we get a quarterly newsletter, and the reason the newsletter is so thick is that every disciplinary action is summarized in the deal. And I glance down mostly to see if there's anybody in there I know. but it just strikes me, and I have not done a statistical analysis, that most of them, at least in Florida, seem to be, I won't say technical violations, but relatively minor violations, and they're usually a fine. Sometimes there's a short suspension. Frequently, they append, and you will take a particular course in ethics, you know, that they have. Rarely is a license revoked, but it happens. It happens. Anybody else aware in your career of ratting? I'll tell you, I was out of town working on a project and having breakfast with a friend who was also a PE, not working on my project, but he lived and worked in that same city where I was there, and we were having breakfast, and I was a couple of minutes late to come to the breakfast table in the hotel, and he was reading, having coffee and reading the morning paper, and you know, we shook hands. I got arrived, we shook hands, hadn't seen him in a couple of months, and we sat there. I mean, you know, have you talked to your old cronies, your old friends, you know, we'd sit and talk about it. Halfway through breakfast, he opened up his paper and he said, "Did you see this?" I said, "No, I haven't read the paper this morning." And there was an article about a guy, and I've forgotten what the crime was, but he was charged with at least 2 felonies. Nothing to do with, and it didn't even mention the fact that this guy was a PE. And it had nothing to do with his professional, it was in his private life. And my friend said he was going to, and I know he did, reported that PE for an ethics because they were crimes of moral turpitude. I can't give you the exact definition of those. My lawyer friend could, and I can't. I know he's done this in the past because we've cited this, and I just have to apologize. I've forgotten exactly what those crimes are. One of the crimes, one of the felonies was fraud. And it didn't have to do with his business, okay? It had nothing to do with his engineering business, but he was reported, and as a result, he eventually was convicted, and the board eventually pulled his license for having committed a moral crime that had nothing to do with his professional practice. So, don't commit crimes. That's the lesson there.
Okay.
That's the only time I know of anybody that's been reported. And I've not seen, and I have to admit, there have been things I've seen over my career that I probably should have reported because I had reason to believe, but I didn't have any evidence. Your gut just told you there was something wrong there, and I never did. but it's interesting. Bud has a whole 5-minute speech about this and how it's important for us to hold to maintain the profession, to do this, to do what I call the rat clause, that we need to rat out the folks that we know are doing bad things. If not only just to protect ourselves. We're catching up here on our time allotment, so I'm going to ask the questions. Ask this. Go ahead.
Mike, can you state what you see as the ethical obligation to the rat clause?
If you have reason to believe.
I understand that. I'm understanding what's the foundation.
Oh, yes. The history or foundation of that clause is from the very first code of ethics that the society adopted before licensure, okay? Before we were a licensed profession, that there had been in the late 1800s and right after the turn of the century, there had been several bad engineering disasters. The Johnstown flood was one of them. There were several just as bad, killed a lot of people, and people were, the general public was beginning to clamor for better behavior from the design professionals. And ASCE resisted licensure and lobbied against it, and instead adopted a strict code of ethics, one part of which we would be self-policing, and we'd rat out the bad people ourselves. That the whole way that we would self-regulate ourselves, and if somebody was doing bad stuff, that their colleagues would rat them out.
Because our first obligation is to the public.
Yes.
And not to our colleagues.
Correct. Or our client, or our colleague, or the company, or our employer, or anything.
It's important to underline. Our first
Yes.
obligation is to the public.
It was a shame, and I've had this conversation with several people in the room, and I hope that over the course of the years, and I hope they'll come in with some thoughts on it. That was at the same time that this society decided that they would not support licensure. When they had the opportunity to take licensure and have a national license administered by the society themselves, none of the states, and we wouldn't have the problem with 57 jurisdictions in the United States. And it's just one of those unfortunate things about ASC that they made that decision. That was what, in around 1910 or so?
1917, I think Wyoming was the first.
Right, but when the society refused, they had the opportunity to set up, the Canadians and the Brits were setting up their system run by their professional society rather than having state licensure boards. And we could have held one license and practiced all over the country. Somebody said they were licensed in a bunch of states. Who was it earlier on? Yeah, how many?
12.
12. Anybody beat 12?
No, I got 10.
Anybody beat 12? What's your annual fee?
Not enough.
No. Not your, how much do you pay to be licensed?
It varies.
Yeah, altogether, the whole thing, total, bottom line, how much money?
It must be close to $2,000.
Yeah.
There was a guy a member of ASCE, he was in ASC News, he was in 50 states, he had licensure. I couldn't imagine how much that would cost. And why he would be the one that would be in all 50 states.
Well, I've worked with guys that wanted to be licensed in a bunch of them. I've never quite seen the. Have we not touched on a subject that someone was hoping we would talk about? Yes.
I've got a question.
Sure.
Like federal government, let's say Corps of Engineers,
Do they have any obligation to sign or put their professional stamp on plans? And this is an issue, I'm a state employee, we have an issue where the Corps of Engineers, we work together in partnership. But they claim, I think it's the federal supremacy doctrine that says that they're not required to have an engineer's stamp or seal the plan. But they may be building the breakwater, I may be building facilities behind it. And I did ask licensing board once, informally. And I said, because there was something questionable about a breakwater, and I said, you know, what liability do I have? And I said, it's a federal breakwater, there's no stamp, no signatures. But they said that ultimately I was responsible if the breakwater failed and the facility behind were damaged. But I mean, did this sound, it was an interesting situation, but they didn't have an answer.
Right.
So they researched.
I wish Bud were here.
Couldn't give me an answer.
Yeah. John, you want to?
As far as I know, the federal engineers, the federal government are not required to be licensed. On the other hand, the Corps in particular really stresses that their engineers be licensed in at least one state, and just about all of them that I know are.
Right.
But there is no obligation. That's because of the sovereign, not immunity, but the sovereign.
Supremacy clause.
Supremacy, right. So, but.
Which would have been taken care of had ASCE done the licensing in 1900. Yeah, go ahead.
I ran into a situation some time ago where the federal side, the engineer said he was a PE and an engineer, and then they found out through, you know, the responsible party, somebody who tried to look him up, not only was he not an engineer, he wasn't a PE, he lost his job, got fined, and all his benefits, and it was pretty incredible. They'll take, they just don't release you, they will,
Put you in 11.
just about, because they had a,
Yeah.
whatever form you filled out, you're basically saying you're truthful with the information you provided. And
When I worked for the Corps, it was required that if you applied for either chief of design or chief of engineering, that you had a license.
Right.
And you had a license in the district or the division that you're responsible for.
What division were you in?
South Pacific, and then San
Right.
Francisco District, Sacramento District.
Right. My experience in working in I've never been an employee of the Corps, but working as a consultant on projects in several Corps districts and divisions around the country, that requirement varies or has varied in where most of the work that I've done has been in the Mississippi Valley Division, not all, but a lot of it. And there, they just ask that you be licensed by some competent jurisdiction, and they don't care where.
I should have been more specific. This is for the chief of those
Well,
organizations. And then employees,
for the,
something else.
they actually, in the
Have the license.
Mississippi Valley Division, the head of the hydraulic engineering branch or section, depending on what it is in which district, must be a PE. You know, it's not just the chief engineer or the chief of design. That breakwater is actually designed, well, they're not doing breakwaters well, they do a little in the Mississippi Valley Division, but.
Alaska, they do a lot.
Yeah, but, right, but they're actually designed by PEs. They don't stamp.
Well, in some cases, they're not designed. Yeah, I mean, you don't know because
Right.
there's no name or stamp. on
Right.
it. But,
Correct.
and if it is a PE, quite often they won't put PE after the name.
Correct.
And
Correct.
there's times when it's not a PE.
That's right.
And then I guess that's another question. I mean, if you are a licensed professional engineer, do you have any obligation to put PE after your name if you do the design? Or can you just, because quite often they'll just, you'll never see PE after the name.
Right.
So I wondered that.
Well, again, in my view, and I'd love to, I don't, nobody's ever asked that question to me before, and I'd love to hear Bud's answer. But to me, without the advice of a lawyer, it all boils down to jurisdiction. If I'm licensed engineer, I'm licensed by a state licensing board. Okay? Therefore, in state proceedings and proceedings that are governed or within the purview of that state licensing board, I need to identify myself as a PE. In a federal proceeding, is not subject to the jurisdiction of the state board.
As you found out.
As the judge of the U.S. Court of Claims clearly stated, she says, I decide who is an expert engineer in my court, not you. Okay? That's my jurisdiction, you stay out of it. So the Army Corps of Engineers, for their project, that's a federal jurisdiction. It's not subject to the state board. Therefore, my state PE doesn't belong on that drawing.
But I guess
To me, it's a jurisdiction.
My argument, though, is that the Great Guard is protecting a state or public facility.
Oh, of course.
It's not protecting a federal or government facility.
Correct.
So that's, where I'm.
Yeah.
I kind of want to follow this.
Yeah, yeah.
What if it's a state facility being designed by the Corps of Engineers?
I don't think it makes any difference. If the Corps is doing it, it's a federal act. They're not involved in anything except federal stuff.
But when you
But you
read
have
the
to have a
supremacy
state-
doctrine, it says that that doctrine applies to federal projects that they own and maintain. So if they're designing a state project, then, and turning it over, then, they're turning over that maintenance and responsibility to someone else.
They do that all the time, continuously.
Yes, and once that levy or whatever gets turned over and the state or the local government does work on it, the engineer will have to be licensed.
Correct.
So do you affix your seal to documents you prepare for the Corps?
I haven't. But so far, I've never done any design drawings for the Corps.
I think a consultant doing work for the Corps, he would have to have a engineer stamp.
I've only ever given, for the Corps work, as a sole practitioner, only ever given a report or oral testimony.
In our state, you're required to, if you read the letter of the law, you're required to affix your seal to a letter with this professional opinion.
That's our state as well.
Where are you?
Louisiana. It says any engineering work, and it goes on to define it as pretty much anything. I mean, if you read it real strictly, it could be an email. But obviously, that's not the intent of it, but it's broad enough to encompass so much that it can be read in many different ways. So we seal our reports typically.
We just got a couple of minutes. Is there anything else you all want to, any other topics you want to hit? If not, I want to thank you all for being a very good audience. You've contributed a lot. I would remind you and turn your attention again every month in Civil Engineering Magazine to read the ethics article. You will find, as it was pointed out to me after I had ignored them through most of my career, and when I was pointed to them several years ago, I find them very entertaining and informative. I think there's more that we didn't cover. Please feel free to read them and read more of them. And I will remind you, for almost everyone here as a diplomate, you need 2 hours of professional training in ethics. And if you simply read that article 12 times a year, you will have your 2 hours of ethical training. Right? There's nothing that says it can't be self-study.
Does the Florida board accept that?
No. The Florida board requires, yeah, the Florida board requires 4 hours of what they call rules and, or Yeah, and very little of it is ethics. It's all about changes in the law and the regulations, and when you seal stuff, it's nuts to sit there for
Along that line, do we get, and we're talking about the Florida PE registration right now, or do you give us, I know some of the portions we take, get our signature and our license.
right. That's why I have a list.
Okay. Just for Florida, the only state bothers you.
Right. Florida's tough. Yes, sir.
And I comment that the New York Times Sunday magazine, every Sunday has a page that's called The Ethicist.
Oh.
And they have, of course, it's not on civil engineering, but, ethics, ethics,
Right.
And so anyway, there's a weekly one that you can add to your read.
That is a good one. I'll try to.
Over in China, and you're working over there, which code of ethics are you obligated to follow?
I follow the U.S. Code of Ethics. I make sure that I do everything as if it were back in Jacksonville. I am very careful to do that because they operate under a whole different system, and they do things quite openly that are not just unethical but illegal here.
And there too,
I don't know that. I can't read the Chinese law. I don't know, but I suspect. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.